Hello everybody, this is the Student Witch. I have a fancy camera now. Thank you, the university, for letting us borrow this camera for research purposes. I just wanted to start the second video on how I make bone broth. If you haven't seen the first video where I describe the health benefits of each ingredient in my bone broth, go check that out on my channel. I ended up getting a much bigger pot, the biggest pot that we own, because the bone was a lot bigger than I originally estimated, and it's a beef bone, organic grass-fed beef, best way to go. So I ended up with a bigger pot. I filtered the water, and I put the bone in. Let me carefully take this lid off. Lots of steam going on. And as you can see, it's kind of cloudy, but the bone is in there. That's the bone. I put in enough water to cover the bone by about 2 or 3 inches. And then I turned the heat on high, and I added about 3/4 of a cup of the Bragg organic raw unfiltered apple cider vinegar. It was the rest that we had in this bottle, so I just decided to use up the rest in the bottle. And like I said in the first video, the apple cider vinegar helps to start breaking down and dissolving the bone itself. Not completely, but it just gives it a head start so that you get as many of the vitamins and minerals and nutrients as you can. So let's see if I can do this without burning myself to show you the size of the bone that we got going on. So that's a pretty big size bone. There's a chunk with some marrow right there. So I put in enough water so that the water was about 2 or 3 inches above the height of the bone in the pot. I turned the heat on high with the apple cider vinegar, and I let it boil down on high heat for probably about 45 minutes to an hour, and now I have it on medium heat, and I'm going to let it cook down some more. I don't want too much of the water to evaporate right now because this cooking process is actually going to last through tomorrow, and it's going to finally end on, today's Wednesday, so it's going to cook through, today's Tuesday, so it's going to cook through Wednesday, and I'm going to finally turn off the heat Thursday morning and strain everything and skim the fat off and all that good stuff, which I'll record and describe as I do it. So I started this at around 4 o'clock on Tuesday. So day 1, at the very beginning, you boil it. But you don't boil all the water off, and you know, if you need to add more water throughout the cooking process, go ahead, it's not going to hurt it. And then tonight, or after another hour or so, I'm going to turn the heat down on low and keep the lid on it, and I'll especially make sure it's on low overnight with the lid on. And then tomorrow morning, that's when I add the vegetables, the herbs, and the ginger and garlic and things like that. Good morning, beautiful people. This is day 2 of our bone broth. It's about 10 in the morning. I had the bone boiling in the water with 3/4 of a cup of apple cider vinegar overnight. It was on very low heat, very low, just on simmer. And this morning I turned the heat up a little bit to medium low, just to get things rolling again. And now I'm going to add the vegetable ingredients. Here I have celery, onion, carrot, 2 garlic cloves, and a piece of ginger, which I cut into quarters. I didn't bother with peeling it just because it's going to be cooking for at least another day, another 24 hours. This is also the day, the second day, when you would add any dried herbs. So here I have basil. I'm also going to add some Italian seasoning, which includes oregano, marjoram, thyme, rosemary, and sage. And I also suggest, again, if you have a Trader Joe's in your area, I mentioned it in the first video because they have a cheaper brand of organic, raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, but they have this stuff called 21 Seasoning Salute, and it's delicious. It's especially good if you're, you know, frying some tilapia fillets or if you're cooking chicken, and it literally has 21 seasonings in it. So I just add a few shakes of this just to add some flavor. So I have all this going on, and this is also when you would add some of the spices. Here I have toasting in a small pan some star anise, coriander seed, cloves, whole cloves, and whole black peppercorns. And so you just want to toast these on a medium to medium-high heat until you start releasing their aromatic qualities. And I just heard one pop, so I think I'm going to turn this off. When you start smelling them, you know that they're done. So let's go ahead and add some of these ingredients. Let me carefully lift this lid. And the beef bone that we're using also had some fat on it. That's okay. The fat, I don't know if you can maybe see some of this fat. The fat will naturally kind of melt and fall apart in the broth. And then tomorrow morning when the broth is finally done, I will let it sit and cool for about an hour or two in the refrigerator. And that's when all the fat will rise to the top and you can skim it off, or most of it off. So when I was toasting these spices, I put my intent in them as I was adding them to the pan. So they're ready to go. So I'm just going to go ahead and add these straight into the broth. There we go. Give these a stir. So, like I said in the first part 1 of this 2-part bone broth series, I add those specific spices to kind of mimic the flavor of pho soup. It's spelt, well, in English characters, or actually the Roman alphabet, but whatever. In English characters, it's spelled P-H-O, so I just say pho. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but it's that delicious Vietnamese soup that is also prepared, you know, traditionally overnight or for hours, boiling down the meat and the bones. And they use those spices like star anise and clove and black peppercorns and coriander to give it that delicious flavor. They also use ginger, so I didn't bother peeling it. I just used a piece of ginger that's about the size of the inside of my palm. So I'm going to add that in. Oops. Watch out for splashing. Onion for flavor and its health properties, which you can look up. This is one fairly large onion. Just going to let that go in and do its thing. I use 2 celery stalks because in this household we are celery addicts, especially my husband. So just be careful not to splash on me. I decided to go with 1 carrot just to make sure I don't overcrowd the pot. And I did wash it off. I wash all my vegetables, but I didn't peel it because, you know, I grew up with the old adage, God made dirt and dirt don't hurt. So there you go. And 2 cloves of garlic. These are medium to large cloves. And I love me some garlic, so I don't mind the strong garlic flavor. 3 bay leaves. And then a few shakes of this Italian dried herb seasoning mix. Alright, there we go. So this stays on the stove on fairly low heat all day. And if you want to make it more concentrated, you can go ahead and leave the lid off for a few hours on low heat. And that will help to evaporate some of the extra water. And you don't want to leave the lid off on high heat and then forget about it, because before you know it, you're going to lose half your liquid. So yeah, so this is day 2. And I'll see you tomorrow morning when I strain everything and put it into containers and skim the fat off and all that fun stuff. So I'll see you on the other side. Bye. Alrighty, YouTubers, we are in the morning. It's about 9:20 in the morning of day 3 of this bone broth process. Last night I turned the heat on really low, just basically to keep it from solidifying. And then when my husband got up, because he woke up a little bit earlier before me, he turned the heat back up to about medium low, just to get things moving and grooving again. And if at this point in the cooking process, if you have fresh herbs, not dried, but fresh herbs, now would be the time that you would add them. I would add them 1 or maybe 2 hours before I plan on turning the stove off and starting the draining process. Because in general, when you're cooking with fresh herbs, you want to add them last, because otherwise they just break down and their flavor and character that they're adding to whatever you're cooking is just becomes lost. So now would be the time to add the fresh herbs like rosemary, parsley, cilantro. I've even added in the past. So yeah, I did not have any fresh herbs on me, so I went ahead and turned the heat off. So let me carefully lift the lid. And man, I wish you guys could smell the amazingness that is this bone broth. Especially after adding those spices yesterday. It just turned out amazing. It smelled so good. So in here you can see we have the vegetables that I added yesterday. You know, the celery, carrot, and the bone, all the fat, or most of the fat that was on the bone has kind of melted away, and even the bone broke apart into 2. This is the main bone here, and let me see if I can fish around and find the other piece. This is the other piece here. So this is what it's gonna end up looking like. It's cooked down quite a bit. I left the lid off a few times yesterday just so that some water could evaporate and the flavors and everything could concentrate. Ooh, here's a big old chunk of gross fat that I'll be straining out. So yeah, this is what it's going to end up looking like, and it smells awesome. So right now, let's see if I can just leave this right here. What you're going to need is a container to put the broth in. A clear glass bowl would work best so that you can clearly see the different layers when the fat rises to the top when you let it cool down in the fridge. But we don't have a clear glass bowl. Right now it's in the dirty dish sink. So I have just this white ceramic kind of bowl. I would try to avoid plastic just because putting hot liquids in plastics makes me nervous. You would need a strainer. I have a wire strainer here just to make sure it catches everything. And after it cools, then it would be okay to put it in plastic containers. We recycle these containers that actually take out from our favorite faux Vietnamese restaurant. And I'm not going to fill it all the way up with the bone broth. I'm just going to portion it out and then put these in the freezer so that I can take them out and add them to my beans or soups or whatever when the time comes. So I'm going to start the straining process, and when I have everything separated out, I'll come back and explain exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I'll see you in a bit. Alright, I've strained most of the larger chunks of ingredients from the bone broth. So here you see the chunks of carrot and celery and pieces of solid fat or even meat that was on the bone. So all of this we're going to put in our freezer compost bag. Since we live in an apartment, we can't have our own compost pile or even our own vegetable garden, which is really unfortunate. But we do freeze all of our organic garbage just to keep it from stinking up the house and the kitchen garbage can. So, and to keep it from attracting fruit flies, because they're terrible down here in the south. So anyway, I just took a colander like this to catch all the big chunks. And here we have the bone. It actually broke into 3 pieces. This is the main piece, and there's still some marrow in there. A second piece here with a little bit of marrow. You can see where it started to break down here. And this third small piece, it's already starting to dry out. And I've actually heard of people reusing the bone until it basically disintegrates. They would just put this back in the freezer and reuse it for future bone broths. I am going to save this. In general, I don't do that because our refrigerator and freezer are very small, so we don't have a lot of room in the freezer to keep things like this. But I'm going to save this bone just for when I make a chicken noodle soup. My husband and I, like I've mentioned in the first video about the bone broth when I talked about the ingredients, in general we try not to eat meat every day. We only eat meat a couple times a week. But every once in a while we'll treat ourselves to a whole chicken, and when we buy chicken we try to buy the whole chickens from a local farmer's co-op, so we know it's local, we know it's free range, and we know it's organic. Even though they're a lot more expensive than the chicken you're getting at the grocery store, we support the local farmer's co-op because if an animal is going to be sacrificed so that we can get nourishment from its body, I feel like we should try to at least make sure that the animal was respected and had a decent life. You know, that's our general rule. We don't always follow it, unfortunately. Oh, there goes a fire truck. But this time when we buy a chicken from the co-op, we will be. So I'm going to save these bones because usually when I bake a chicken we have lots of leftovers, and I like to boil the chicken carcass down to make homemade chicken noodle soup, and I might even make a video about that. So when I boil the chicken bones, leftover chicken bones and the carcass down, I'm going to throw these bones in just to add a little bit more depth to the chicken soup broth. and more nutrients and whatnot. So I'm going to save these bones. Apparently you can reuse them over and over again for future bone broths until they basically disintegrate away. If you have room in your freezer to keep the bones until next time, go ahead and do that. And I'm going to strain this, or get rid of this, and then strain the rest of the liquid, which is here. As you can see, I took out all the big chunks. So now I'm going to take this strainer and get all the finer material out of there. So, see you in a second. Alright, so in the finer wire mesh strainer, you see there's just some onions, chunks of garlic, smaller ingredients that were still floating around in the broth, some cloves and peppercorns that I couldn't pick out with the just with a spoon. So let me get this out of the way. So this is what your bone broth should look like. If you do decide to add fresh herbs in the morning of the third day for a few hours before you start straining, it will have a slight greenish tint to it because I guess cooking down the fresh herbs, depending on how much you put in there, it can take out the chlorophyll from the plant, and it's totally fine. I don't mind the color, so unless you have a weird thing about eating food that's colored green, it should taste just fine, and the chlorophyll from like the cilantro leaves or the parsley or whatever isn't going to hurt you. So what I'm going to do now, this is still fairly hot, so I'm going to leave this on the countertop to cool for about an hour, and then I'm going to put it in the refrigerator for an hour or two. And after a few hours in the refrigerator, you'll notice all the fat is going to rise to the top, and it's actually going to form a solid layer across the top. And that becomes really helpful because you can just take a spoon and you just break the layer apart and just throw it in your organic garbage or just throw it away. So that way you take most of the fat out. So when that process starts, I'll be back and show you guys how to take the fat off. So see you in a few hours. Alright, here we are finally at the last stage of this bone broth. Thanks for making it to the end if you're still here with me. So I know I said you could wait for an hour for it to cool and then just put it in the refrigerator for a couple hours. Well, actually it took about twice as long as I expected, so it's around 7 o'clock p.m. here on Thursday. I did just give it extra time in the refrigerator because I had other stuff to do. But I would actually let it sit and cool on the countertop for 2 hours and then leave it in the refrigerator for 3 or 4 hours because it took longer for it to cool, and it also took a little bit longer for that layer of fat to solidify on the top. If I shake this, you'll notice that the bone broth is still very liquidy. This depends, or I guess the level of liquidness, I'm inventing words now, but you know what I mean. The level of, or how solid it turns out depends on what kind of bone you end up getting. If you get a bone like a knuckle joint or a bone with a lot of cartilage in it, or neck bones and tail bones with lots of cartilage in it, that cartilage turns into a natural gelatin, and that is actually the best type of bone to get. So if you do get those types of bones, the broth itself is going to turn out to be a lot more solid. This is a little bit more liquidy because the bone that I got didn't have too much cartilage, but it did have a good amount of marrow and meat on it, and the minerals of the bone itself are beneficial too. So you see here, this is a layer of fat. Now, to remove the layer of fat, I have my frozen organic garbage bag ready, because this is all going straight back into the freezer. And I just try to take a butter knife and just kind of go around the edge, like so, just to loosen things up. Start to see it already breaking apart. There we go. Throw that in the sink. And the other dishes I have to do. And since this bone broth turned out to be fairly liquidy, I'm just going to use a slotted spoon. And I'm just going to try to grab as much of that fat as possible. Get rid of all that grossness. And I guess if your diet and if your health needs are okay with it, you can totally leave the fat in if that's what you're into. I just personally don't really like the fat. I mean, a certain level of animal fat is healthy, especially if it's like grass-fed beef or lamb with those omega-3 fatty acids instead of high amounts of omega-6s, which corn-fed graze animals end up having. But yeah, I just try my best to take the fat out no matter what. Just for good measure. So, and now your bone broth, after this long ass 3-day process, your bone broth is ready to either be used in a soup, to prepare beans, to add flavor to whatever you're cooking, or you can pour it into little containers and freeze it, and you can use it within a month. So this amount of bone broth for us lasts almost a month. So there you go. I hope everybody enjoys some bone broth. And blessed be. Thanks for watching. See you later.